After his return from the defeat of Chedorlaomer and the kings who were with him, the king of Sodom went to meet him in the valley of Shave, that is the king's valley. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was a priest of God Most High. And he blessed him and said, Blessed be Abram by God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. And Abram gave him a tenth of everything. And the king of Sodom said to Abram, Give me the persons, but take the goods for yourself. But Abram said to the king of Sodom, I have lifted my hand to the Lord, God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, that I would not take a thread or a sandal strap or anything that is yours, lest you should say, I have made Abram rich. I will take nothing but what the young men have eaten, and the share that the men who went with me. Let Aner, Ishkol, and Mamre take their share.
Good morning. If you'd like to open up your Bibles to Genesis 14, that's going to be our text for this morning. That's Genesis chapter 14, and I'm excited about it today. This is going through Genesis as we have been, has been something, at least in a sermon kind of setting. I've never done anything like this before, and I've learned so much about it. And the thing that I'm trying to do is, as I read through the text, I'm trying not to just read through the text and say, there's the story that I know. I'm trying to stop after every single sentence and say, so what lesson is there in that for me? What can I learn about God, and how can I learn about how to live? And I know that you know all of this. We've been doing it for quite a while now. But here's the thing. I saw some things in Genesis 14 that we're going to talk about today that I've never seen before, and I'm really excited to share them with you and to talk about some of these things. It's always fun to learn new things about the Bible and to find new ways to, hopefully, at least new things to work on in my life to be a better servant for Him. And so that's what we're going to do today. I see that there are a handful of visitors with us today, and you're very welcome. I'm glad that you decided to stop by. And there's a couple that I do want to at least point your attention to in case you didn't see. Adam Deloge is back. Do you remember that he was here with us last summer? He had a internship in St. Louis. And I was talking to Danton the other day, for those of you who were here in the Danton era. And I talked about, it was a whole era all by itself, wasn't it? And I told him that Danton, he was a student in the St. Louis area. And I said, you did the student thing right. Because even though you were here and it was temporary and you were only a student, man, he jumped in and he was a part of this church family for the time that he was here. Adam was only here for a summer and he did the same. And so it's like a part of our church family is back. And so it's good to see you. And also, Adam's parents are in town. And so make sure that you take a chance to get to meet them. Adam is somebody that we all have come to love. And when you get to meet his parents, well, that is something you should do. And so there's that. Also, sorry I'm going to put you on the spot here, but this means a lot. You all know how much the church in Brandon means to me. I didn't tell you about this. David, who took me under his wing and raised me up, that's his sister-in-law over here. So we'll make that connection. But John Gazzetta is the relatively-ish new preacher at the Brandon church, and they're passing through town. And I've never met him before, and it's like that connection to a church who, there's no words to describe the level of patience that a church had to have to bring me from zero to wherever I ended up. I have eternal debt and gratitude for that church. And so when there's any connection at all with that group of people, I want to share it with you. So welcome, Gazettas. It's really nice to see you this morning and have you with us. Okay, Genesis chapter 14. Let's start. Let's do this. We're going to read verses 1 through 4. And you're going to be patient with me because I'm going to just massacre most of these names. I am absolutely certain of that. Be patient with me. We'll read verses 1 through 4. And then as soon as we read it, you'll say, what did I just read? We'll throw a map up on the wall and we'll see if we can figure out what's going on here. So verses 1 through 4. In the days of Amraphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Elasar, Kedorlaomer, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of Goim, these kings made war with Bera, king of Sodom, Birsha, king of Gomorrah, Shinab, king of Admah, Shemeber, king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is Zoar. And all these joined forces in the valley of Siddim, that is the Salt Sea. 12 years they had served Kedorlaomer, but in the 13th year they rebelled. Okay, here's what we're looking at. And this is probably, I know you read all of these names that you don't know and all of these places that you don't know, but you at least need to be able to see on a map because it's a really big deal what's going on here. Here is the Dead Sea for your reference. In Jerusalem, there's Salem, Jerusalem. This is the desert, and this is the Fertile Crescent. And so, you see this line right here? This is the Euphrates River. In the Bible, kingdoms, this is the Promised Land. Kingdoms on this side of the Euphrates River are called those in the land beyond the river. When you see a reference to the land beyond the river, it's those guys up there. And the first 4 kings that we read about are kings in the land beyond the river. And so we read about Shinar, the king of Shinar. Shinar's Babylon. We've already studied about that because that's the land of Ur where Abraham came from. The Tower of Babel was built in the land of Shinar. So that's Babylon. You've got Elam. We made a reference to that. The Goim, that's probably these people up here, the Hittites. And so chapter 14, verses 1 through 4. There were 4 kings listed, and just think of it like this. And I think you would even be okay to say these are the bad guys. 4 kings listed in the land beyond the river. And what these 4 kings do is they come down and they fight against people in the Promised Land. So I'm going to zoom in on this right here. I'm sorry for the quality of this picture, but we read about the king of Sodom, the king of Gomorrah, the king of Zoar, the king of Admah, and the king of Zeboim. And so there's just like an idea of what we're looking at. And this is probably worth at least mentioning. Sodom and Gomorrah are listed on the map there. We really have no idea where they are. But these are like somebody would say, this is my best guess. So here's what we just read. This is the thing to note about what we just read. For 12 years, these guys overpowered these guys. And they said, you're going to pay us tribute, taxes. It's like a bully who goes up to somebody and says, give me your lunch. And so for 12 years, these guys stole these guys' lunch. And in the 13th year, these guys said, no, you're not having my lunch anymore. Well, then in the 14th year, these guys said, I'm coming to take your lunch by force. And when they came to fight and conquer against these people, they just took everything home with them. And Lot was a part of that. Read verses 11 and 12 with me. In verses 11 and 12. So the enemy, that's these guys. So the enemy took all the possessions of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their provisions and went on their way. They also took Lot, the son of Abram's brother, who was dwelling in Sodom, and the possessions, and they went on their way. So that's the thing that you need to know about what's going on in this text. You've got these 4 kings fighting against these 5 kings, and the 4 kings come down and they take all the 5 kings. stuff. I do want to remind you of something. Go back up to chapter 13 and verses 8 through 13. Just in case you weren't here last Sunday when we talked about Abraham and Lot parting ways. Lot got carried away. Whenever the kings came and fought against Sodom, Lot was kind of connected to Sodom. He decided to go and associate himself with Sodom. That was a choice that he made all by himself. He decided that on his own. We talked about it last week, chapter 13 and verse 8. Then Abram said to Lot, "Let there be no strife between you and me, and between your herdsmen and my herdsmen, for we are kinsmen. Is not the whole land before you? Separate yourself from me. If you take the left hand, then I will go to the right. Or if you take the right hand, then I'll go to the left." And here's the thing. Lot lifted up his eyes and saw that the Jordan Valley was well watered everywhere, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt in the direction of Zoar. This is going to be our point in just a second. But do you know what you just read there? Lot saw that the grass was greener over there. I mean, literally, that's what it was. He saw that the grass was greener over there. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. Verse 11. So Lot chose for himself all the Jordan Valley, and Lot journeyed east. Remember, that's in Genesis. He's moving away from the presence of God. He made that decision of his own volition to go over there, to move away from the presence of God. They separated from each other. Abram settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled among the cities of the valley and moved his tent as far as Sodom. Now the men of Sodom were wicked, great sinners against the Lord. So we're going to stop here for just 1 second, and we're going to talk about our first couple of lessons. As we read through the text, there's a couple things that really hit me kind of hard this week, and it's worth thinking about. Number one is just the old proverb. It's not a Bible proverb, but it's a true life proverb, and one that we should probably pay some attention to. Lot saw that the grass was greener over there, but it turns out the grass may have been greener, but there's a lot of baggage that comes with it. And so this is the proverb. The grass isn't always greener on the other side. That's the lesson. And we spent all last Sunday morning talking about that, about how Lot was driven by his eyes and by his earthly, carnal, physical desire to go over there and to have the best instead of sticking with God like Abraham did. And what Lot learned the hard way is that even though the grass is greener over there, doesn't mean life is better. There's a proverb that I would like for you to write down, and this might be one of those. If this is the thing that you do, I would think that this is one worth memorizing. Or maybe you're not going to actually memorize the proverb or where it is, but remember it. Remember the concept. In Proverbs 15 and verse 16, better is a little with the fear of the Lord than great treasure with trouble with it. And Lot got to learn this lesson, didn't he? He got to say, oh, hey, look, there's the green grass. I want to go over there. And guess what came with the green grass? Whenever you park your tent on Sodom's doorstep, he got caught up in Sodom's mess. That's the next thing that I want to point to here. If you park your tent on Sodom's doorstep, don't be surprised when it gets burned down. Lot decided, hey, the green grass is worth living among these wicked people. And the text twice in Genesis 13, the text twice reminds us about this. This was before God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. And then the very last thing that he says in verse 13, now the men of Sodom were wicked, great sinners against the Lord. And apparently this is not something that Lot registered and processed. He said, I know what kind of people they are, but the grass is green and I want to go there anyway. And so, lo and behold, this is the way I would think about this. You know the Dead Sea? I'm not going to go back to the map. You know the Dead Sea? It's the lowest place on earth. Geographically, it's the lowest place on earth. Associate that, since Sodom is right next to it, associate that with morality too. Here is the lowest place on earth. And Lot chose to go there. And don't be surprised when you decide to go to the lowest place on earth if you get caught up in some of their nonsense. I think that you can see this about Lot. Stick your marker in Genesis 14, because this is our text and we're going to come back. But go to 2 Peter chapter 2. I think that we can cut Lot a little bit of slack, because you read 2 Peter chapter 2, I think it's verses 7 and 8. It's not like Lot was just all on board with the sin that existed in Sodom. He didn't like it. He didn't want to be any part of it. And we're going to take this out of its context just to see this about Lot. It says in verse 7 that God rescued righteous Lot, and righteous Lot was greatly distressed by the sensual conduct of the wicked, for as that righteous man lived among them day after day, he was tormenting his righteous soul over their lawless deeds that he saw and heard. And so, one of the things that at least ought to roll through your mind is, then why did you choose to park your tent on their doorstep? That should be one of our takeaways from this. In Genesis 13, this was not something that was inflicted upon him. It was a choice that he made. He chose to go to the lowest place on earth. And when we make that choice, don't be surprised when your tent gets burned up with the rest of the city. That's our main takeaway, at least one of our main takeaways from this lesson. I would at least say this. This is not only for the kids. You look at people in the world, and we say, look at all of the things that they get to do, and look at all of the places that they get to go, and I don't get to do those things, and I don't get to go those places because I'm a Christian, and they get to talk in a certain way. I don't get to talk in that way, and we say to our kids, we don't do that. We're God's people. We don't do that, and it might be tempting to look at the world, to look at Sodom and say, man, I wish that I could just have at least a little part of that. I wish that I could just live by it. And I think it would be really cool. It would be really cool if we could learn the lesson by reading about it instead of making our own mistakes and getting caught up in Sodom's mess in the first place. So there's a couple things to think about. Let's move on. Genesis chapter 14 and verses 14 through 16. Lot has been taken captive. So here's Abraham's response. When Abram heard that his kinsman had been taken captive, he led forth his trained men, born in his house, 318 of them, and went in pursuit as far as Dan. And he divided his forces against them by night, he and his servants, and defeated them, and pursued them to Hobah north of Damascus. Then he brought back all the possessions, and also brought back his kinsman Lot with his possessions and the women of the people. And so here's a second couple of things that I would throw out there for you. This is takeaway application point number 2. What do we do when our people get caught up in Sodom's mess? We round up the posse and we go save them. Stuart, this is the point. I told Stuart earlier this morning, I said, hey, last week I'm learning these lessons about Genesis 14 and I'm seeing the applications in here. And when I see these things and I start to word them in this way, you take the lessons from the text and you turn them into principles. I told Stuart, I thought a lot about him last week. In the 8.5 years that my family has been here, a couple different times, my family, we're going to talk about this in principle terms, concept terms, right? My family has been caught up in Sodom's mess. Call it the teenage years. Whatever you want to call it. My family has got caught up in Sodom's mess. And what do you do when your people get caught up in Sodom's mess? You round up the posse and you say, would you please go and help me save my people? And the reason why I mentioned Stuart about that is because we've done it more than once, where I called up Stuart and I said, hey, I need some help. And I would like to think that Stuart would think of me as his posse. Also, here's the thing. Take the principle. Take the concept. If you're not somebody plugged into the church family, this is at least one good reason why you should think about doing that. Jumping in and be a part of the family, because at some point in your life, your people are going to get caught up in Sodom's mess, and you're going to need some help to go and save them. And that's one reason why a church family is so awesome, is to say, hey, the enemy has a hold on my people. Can you go get them with me? I can't tell you how many times I've sent out text messages to the posse and said, I'm going to need some help getting my people unlocked from the mess that Sodom got them hooked up into. There's this, I love this, was worth sharing. I like this a lot. There's this quote from Victor Hamilton's commentary on Genesis. I had to look up one of these words. I didn't know one of these words in this quote. Abram holds no grudges against Lot. Lot took the best of the land. And it could have been easy for Abraham to say, hey man, you chose your lot. Ooh, see the joke there? You chose your lot. See what I did there? Sorry. You chose to go over in that direction. This is the consequence of you deciding to park your tent by Sodom. You get carried away, now you have to deal with it. Abraham didn't do any of that. There were no grudges, there were no hard feelings. Abram holds no grudges against Lot, nor does the uncle dismiss his nephew as avaricious. That's the word that I looked up. It's like covetous. It's a person who wants more and more and more and more. That's avaricious. He didn't say, Lot, you chose your path, so you're an avaricious person, you're a compulsive person, therefore you're not worth the necessary effort to go after and free from your captors. He said, that's my people need help, so let's get the family together and go get them. That's what a church family does. You know who else does that? I'm not going to read any verses about it, but that is basically that's the simple version of Jesus in the gospel. Imagine Jesus in heaven, sitting comfortably on his throne with the Father, looking down at the world, saying, those people need my help. They need saving. There's nothing that's going to come on their own unless I go down there and get them. And so he went and he got them. And it's not just a message of the gospel of Jesus and salvation for us. It's a practical picture of what we as a church family do with one another. And so two things about that. Well, let's just call it one thing about that. Here's the thing. When your family gets caught up in Sodom's mess, get on the phone or say, hey, you're sitting right in front of me. I always pick on the people sitting right in front. Send a text message. I need help. Would you go and get my people back? Just practical takeaway. There's another thing about this that I thought was really neat. Do you remember in these verses it says that Abraham and his people went as far as Dan to fight against these kings of the north? Whenever you hear in the Bible, there's a saying. The saying is from Dan to Beersheba. And when you hear that saying, it's from the northernmost point of Israel to the southernmost point of Israel. And so when the text says that Abraham and his men went as far as Dan to rescue his family, Lot, it's like saying this. How far do we go to save our people? As far as you have to go. All the way to the border. That's one of the concepts. That's one of the principles that we take away from this. Okay, last. Just one more thing, and then we'll be done with this lesson this morning. There's a couple background pieces that I want you to pay close attention to, because I think if we are a Hebrew reader reading this text for the very first time, I think that these things would just jump out at us. We would know them automatically, but we probably need to do a contrast here. First of all, we know we know everything that we need to know about Sodom. In chapter 13 and verse 10, we have a prelude to the destruction of Sodom that's coming because of their sin. In chapter 13 and verse 11, Lot journeyed east so that we know we've moved away from the presence of God. In chapter 13 and verse 13, now the men of Sodom were wicked and great, sinners against the Lord. Here are a couple of things that I did not know coming into this text, and they got wrote in the margin of my Bible. The king of Sodom and the king of Gomorrah are Bera and Birsha. And Bera is a Hebrew word that means son of evil. So we're painting a picture of Sodom and Gomorrah. We already know that they're evil, but the king of Sodom is literally called son of evil. And the king of Gomorrah is literally called son of wickedness. I have a hard time thinking that this is their real actual name. It's probably the Bible saying this is who these people are. They are son of evil and son of wickedness. In just a minute, when we read through the text, we're going to read about Melchizedek. But I want to tell you a couple things about Melchizedek before we actually read about him, some things that we'll talk about tonight. In tonight's lesson, we're going to spend all of our time talking about Melchizedek. But here's some things you need to know. His name, Melech, is the Hebrew word that means king. Tzedek is the Hebrew word that means righteousness. So Melchizedek is king of righteousness. We're comparing that with the king of Sodom, son of evil, son of wickedness. The opposite is the king of righteousness. Melchizedek, king of righteousness. He's king over Salem, Shalom, king of righteousness, king of peace, and he's called a priest of the Most High God. And so what do we have in this text when we read about these? We have really bad and we have really good. It's a contrast story, isn't it? So let's read it. And as we read it, I want to see if you can get the principle. See if you get the point all by yourself. Starting in verse 17, we're going to read down to verse 24. After his return from the defeat of Kedorlaomer and the kings who were with him, the king of Sodom went out to meet Abraham at the valley of Shaveh, that is the king's valley. And Melchizedek, the king of righteousness, the king of Shalom, peace, brought out bread and wine. He was priest of God Most High, and he blessed him. Melchizedek blessed Abraham and said, "Blessed be Abram by God Most High, possessor of the heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand." And Abram gave him a tenth of everything. 21. And the king of Sodom said to Abram, "Give me the persons, but take the goods for yourself." But Abram said to the king of Sodom, "I have lifted my hand to the Lord God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, that I would not take a thread or a sandal strap or anything that is yours, lest you should say, 'I have made Abram rich.' I will take nothing but what the young men have eaten, and the share of the men who were with me. Let Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre take their share." Did you see a principle in any of this text and what's going on here? I take the principle like this. Go back to verse 18. The king of righteousness, the king of peace. I'm making a list. King of righteousness, king of peace, brought out bread and wine. You know, in the Bible, when you see food is always fellowship in the Bible. You don't sit down and eat a meal with your enemies. Food is fellowship. If you're breaking bread with someone, you're not breaking heads with someone. And so here is the king of righteousness, the king of peace. There's fellowship involved in this story. He's a priest of God Most High. There's a blessing that's involved. Melchizedek is blessing Abraham. There's giving and sharing in verse 20, the second part of verse 20. Abraham gave him a tenth. So you've got this Abraham and the King of righteousness and the King of peace are all about the fellowship and the blessing and the sharing with one another. And then you've got Sodom, the son of evil, and all of the wickedness associated with him. And Abraham says, I don't want anything that you have. I'm not taking a thread or a sandal from you. That's actually what it says in the text. I don't want anything to do with you. Do you know what this story reminds me of? Do you remember when Jesus was being tempted in the wilderness by the devil? And the devil comes to Jesus and he says, hey, let's talk about some bread. And Jesus says, no. The devil, one of the temptations is he says, here are the kingdoms of the world. I will give you everything, Jesus. And Jesus' response to the devil was, I don't want anything that you have to offer. I don't want anything associated with you or with your ways or with your name. Keep it for yourself. Even though by taking Sodom's stuff, Abraham would have made himself excessively rich. He said, this is our takeaway. This is a question. Would you rather? I like to ask my kids these things all the time. And one of my go-tos is always something like this. It's always like, would you rather paint your face with honey and stick it in a nest of fire ants, or, and give them some equally horrible things. So here's our thing. Would you rather be connected and associated with God and his blessing and righteousness and peace, or be connected with and associated with Sodom's wealth and everything that Sodom has to offer? It's an either or. Which would you rather choose? Abraham is a great example of what Lot did not do. That didn't make any sense. Lot chose to go live in the green grass next to Sodom. Abraham said, I don't want any part of that. I want to share one thing with you on this one. I got to say this also. There's even nasty language. Verse 21. This is what Sodom says. Abraham and Melchizedek is like sharing and fellowship and blessing and all of this stuff. The king of Sodom says, and listen to what he says, give me the person, but take the goods from yourself. It's very clearly a contrast. Turn over to Amos with me. Amos chapter 6. A couple weeks ago, I was teaching Amos on Wednesday night, and I did not get to my last point, and so this is kind of my opportunity to do that last point, but this one is a good one. I think it fits in with what we're talking about right now. We said with Amos, what's the problem with the people that Amos is writing to? And we said they hate the truth. They say, don't prophesy to us. We don't want to hear anything about what God has to say. They reject justice and righteousness. And their religion is empty. They're very religious people, but their religion doesn't lead to anything good. I had a fourth thing on my list, and the bell rang, and we ran out of time. But the fourth thing on the list is the lesson that we learned from Abraham right now. Amos chapter 6, starting in verse 4. Woe to those who lie on beds of ivory and stretch themselves out on their couches, and eat lambs from the flock and calves from the midst of the stall. This is the good life. You see what's being described here? I'm lying on a bed of ivory. I'm eating the fat food, and this is the good life. Woe to those who are living the good life. In verse 5, they sing idle songs to the sound of the harp, and like David, they invent for themselves instruments of music, who drink wine in bowls. The wine is such a major part of what we do. It's not a cup, it's a bowl that we drink it from. They're living the good life. They anoint themselves with the finest oils. But listen to this. This is worth highlighting in your Bible. But they are not grieved over the ruin of Joseph. They're soaking up all the benefits of the sinful world that they live in, but they don't open their eyes and look around and say, oh man, like Lot, this is bad. This is a sinful world, and I am surrounded. They're not grieved by it. They're living with all the benefits with no sorrow for the sin that brought the benefits. And this is one of the scariest verses in Amos in verse 7. Therefore, they shall now be the first of those who go into exile. and the revelry of those who stretch themselves out shall pass away. And so I connect that with our story with Abraham, because here is the sinful world of Sodom, and Abraham says, keep it for yourself. I don't want anything to do with it. That's our takeaway, right? That's our main point. And our main takeaway from this, we live in the world, we're surrounded by the world, we see evil on every corner, in our phones, on our computers, right in front of our faces. I know that most of you work in it. You live and work, not of any fault of your own. I mean, you got to feed your family. I got it. You work in the midst of Sodom. You live it on a daily basis. I think one of the great lessons, though, from Amos about people who lived in the midst of it and were not grieved about their sin, or one of the great lessons of Abraham or Jesus saying, keep your sin, keep your stuff. I don't want to be associated with that in any way. One of the great lessons for us is to stay unstained from the world. Whatever the world has to offer, I don't want it, because we saw what happened already in the story. If you park your tent on Sodom's doorstep, don't be surprised when it gets burned up. Here's another lesson. Lot learned that the grass isn't greener. Number 3, when your people get caught up in Sodom's mess, round up the posse and go rescue them. And finally, always choose God's righteousness, God's peace, God's blessing, God's fellowship over anything that's connected with Sodom. That's Genesis chapter 14, and some things that we might take away from that. If you're here this morning and you're not a Christian, Jesus said, if you're wondering about this concept and how difficult it sounds, he prayed to God and he said, God, listen, I'm not asking you to take my people out of the world. That's impossible. Well, at least in this life, it's impossible. We live in the world. And Jesus said, I'm not asking you to take my people out of the world, but help them to not be of the world, even though they're in it. And that's what Christianity is. Christianity is to say, I am coming to God through faith in Jesus. I'm ready to repent of my sins, which is basically this. I've lived in Sodom and I'm ready to leave the city. I'm ready to repent of my sins, to walk out of that way of life, and to do with this sinful, dead thing the exact same thing we do with all dead things, bury them. Bury the old, sinful, dead person in the waters of baptism, and when I come up in newness of life, to live with the King of righteousness, with the King of peace and fellowship and blessing, and to say, to the very best of my ability, I want nothing to do with the world, so far as it is within my power. If we can help you with that this morning, come forward, make your needs known as we sing the invitation song.